This is Never Again. What do you do with 8 million Nazis? This is the story of the aftermath of World War II. Germany and Japan were utterly defeated. Foreigners patrolled their streets, and all across the newsreels, portraits of their unforgivable crimes. Everything the Axis had fought for was a tangle of lies. Among the Allied, sweet relief. In America, couples wed by the age of 21 and gave birth to the largest generation in American history. In Russia, there were tears for the tens of millions who had fallen. And everywhere there were parades. And yet, while Americans celebrated, Russians lived and died in fear. While Americans had a booming economy and modernizations, in Russia there were show trials and disappearances. And soon, the Allies realized Nazis and the Japanese still threatened them. Millions of true believers were loose. Would the Axis defeat lead to a nuclear world war? What do you do with tens of millions of potential Hitlers and Tojos? This is part one, Partition and Occupation of Germany, 1945 to 1951. World War II creates wicked problems that we must consider. A wicked problem is a problem for which there is no good solution. Or, when you solve the problem, you create three more problems to go along with it. One thing was, the war had cost Britain and Russia nearly everything they had. Britain's debt was now 240% of its GDP, and Russia had lost 22 to 27 million people, at least. Some estimates are as high as 31 million. America stayed intact. While it had lost 409,000 people, and its debt was the highest in its history, it knew it had saved the world. Indeed, during World War II, the size of our economy literally doubled. You could say that World War II created a lot of prosperity within the United States. But horrible problems demanded solutions. How do you denazify 64 million Germans? How do you dehypnotize 72 million Japanese? What about the architects of the Holocaust? What about the perpetrators of the rape of Nanking, China? What about the twisted doctors of Unit 731, which was Japan's equivalent of the twisted Nazi experiments? What do you do with Germany and Japan? Do you befriend them? Do you build them up? And do you hope for the best after what they've done? Or do you dismember and destroy them, like Stalin was doing to his new country, East Germany? The past was repeating itself. Everything that had led to World War II, starvation, despair, rage, all of these things were happening again. And then there was the atomic bomb. Others wanted it. Some of these men were completely terrifying. And people knew. The Nazis had tried to develop horrible weapons of mass murder. They had death factories, they had rockets, and they were developing their own atomic bomb. And the Japanese may have used chemical and biological weapons. What was next? A hydrogen bomb? Genetic weapons? What unknown mayhem awaited? Everywhere the Allies looked, they saw wicked problems. Problems where the solution unleashed a hydra's head of potential catastrophes. Yes, they had solved the war. But what about starvation? Starvation leads to wars. What about Stalin's hunt for an atomic bomb? Stalin was worse than Hitler. What about the rise of communism and its death camps? Were things actually better? Or was the world sliding into the sewer? Soon, one wrong move might literally lead to the deaths of 90% of all life on Earth. Within a few years, a few decades, Both sides, the Russians and the Americans, would have well over 60,000 nuclear bombs. Soon there was the Potsdam Conference. This was a meeting between the big three. Nobody could wait for the Potsdam Conference. Churchill, Truman, and Stalin met in Potsdam, Germany, to work out the final details of the war. In this conference, they agreed to number one, split Germany into 4 zones: American, British, French, and Russian. 2, move Poland's borders to make Stalin happy. Stalin always wanted everybody else to be as far away from him as possible. He wanted to have a buffer zone around himself. So Poland lost some of its land in the east and gained part of Germany in the west. 3, the Allies agreed to hold war crimes trials. Now, against America's wishes, Germany was split into 2 separate countries. America had actually wanted a strong Germany that would help Europe thrive. Stalin, on the other hand, wanted Germany destroyed, decimated, and obliterated. So the question became, what do you do with tens of millions of Hitler youth? For America and Britain, this was a complex problem. It promised to take years, probably decades, and it would cost millions, and it would potentially end in heartache. For Stalin, it meant making thousands of German officers disappear. At Tehran in 1943, he proposed that the Allies execute 50 to 100,000 German officers as a lesson. Outraged, Churchill said no. Next comes the Iron Curtain. As he had in the 1930s regarding Hitler, Winston Churchill now had a warning for the world. He said, the communist parties, which were very small in all of these eastern states of Europe, have been raised to a preeminence and power far beyond their numbers and are seeking everywhere to obtain totalitarian control, meaning absolute dictatorship. He added, no one knows what Soviet Russia and its Communist International Organization intends to do. An iron curtain has descended. All are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a measure of control from Moscow. So we had better toughen up, he added, because there was nothing which the Russians admire so much as strength, and there is nothing for which they have less respect than military weakness. Now, the world hated hearing this message from Churchill. Wasn't Stalin Uncle Joe? Wasn't he the brave Russian who helped beat the Nazis? Wasn't he America and Britain's friend? But the world trusted Churchill and believed he was right. They hadn't in the 30s when he had warned about Hitler. The world learned its lesson. Just 4 weeks before, on February the 9th, 1946, Stalin gave a terrifying speech where he said capitalism and imperialism make future wars inevitable. That speech had horrified the world. Then came the Berlin blockade. Events nearly turned violent. Berlin is located in the worst possible place. It was deep within Russia's buffer zone of satellite nations. And now Berlin was embarrassing the Russians. See, Berlin was split 4 different ways, just like Germany was. There were free zones, that was the English, French, and American zones. And then there was the enslaved zone, that was the zone held by the Soviet Union, by Stalin. The Western zone, the Americans, French, and British, was starting to take off. There were jobs, there was prosperity, there was food, there were easier living situations. The West Berliners were luxuriating in a post-war boom. Indeed, West Germany soon became the 5th wealthiest country on Earth. Meanwhile, the Eastern zone was going nowhere and actually going backwards. Now, Stalin had worked hard to establish communism in 7 Eastern European countries. Meanwhile, the Westerners were making it look defective. so Stalin cut off food and medicine to East Berlin. Now the Americans started to freak out. West Berlin was under the Americans' protection. If Stalin starved them, then what other bullying would Stalin do across the world? It turns out a lot. But from Stalin's point of view, Germany had attacked Russia twice in 2 world wars. If Russia didn't utterly beat Germany down, then who would guarantee that the Third Reich wouldn't rise again, this time with nuclear bombs? After the Berlin blockade came the Berlin airlift. At first, the Americans tried sending in food on land by cars, trucks, and trains, but the Russians blocked them. Eventually, they defied Stalin and airlifted food into Berlin. And this worked. After a certain point, Stalin decided Berlin was not worth starting World War III over. Instead, he focused on building his own atomic bomb. So World War III could have started in 1948 with the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift, but it also could have started in 47, 49, 50, 51, 54, 59, 60, 61, 2, and 63, 64, 68, 79, and 83, and those are just for starters. If you read up on this, there are 25 separate situations that could have led to World War III rather easily. The world dodged a bullet something like 25 separate times. The weapons were bigger and more deadly than ever before. The world truly lucked out. These are just a few examples. In 47, Stalin gave his speech, followed by Churchill's Iron Curtain warning. That was essentially both sides throwing down the gauntlet. In 49, America lost its ally China to communism. In fact, the world's worst mass murderer, Mao, took over China. Stalin celebrated. In 1950, the Korean War started. In 1951, to win the Korean War, General MacArthur wanted to use nuclear bombs. Truman worried that nukes would easily escalate the situation into World War III. At this point, the Soviets had the bomb. In 1954, the Vietnam War started, and it threatened to draw in every superpower: China, the Soviet Union, the Americans, and the British Empire. In 1959, Cuba went communist. This was a nation in America's hemisphere, and now it allied itself with the Soviet Union. In 1960, President Kennedy was elected on a platform to confront the Russians always and everywhere. In 61, though, America failed to support its allies in Cuba, leading to their deaths at the Bad Pigs. Many American allies, over 1,000, were killed on the spot. Historian David Nassau said that the Bad Pigs may be the greatest low point of any presidency. Any one of these incidences could have led to a full-blown World War III. Here's more. In 1961, the Berlin Wall went up. In 1962 was the Cuban Missile Crisis. This led people to believe that the Soviet Union would obliterate Washington, D.C., that bombs from launch to explosion were less than 10 minutes away. In 1963, President Kennedy was murdered by communist Lee Harvey Oswald, if you believe that Oswald killed Kennedy, which is something I'm not going to get into. In 1964, America sent 500,000 troops to Vietnam, and the war dragged on forever. It dragged on for another 11 years and ended extremely tragically for America and for the Vietnamese. In 1968, the American media proclaimed the war unwinnable. America had won every battle, and the war was considered to be lost. America itself appeared to be divided against itself. In 1979, the Russians invaded Afghanistan and killed 1 million people, and America funded Russia's opponents. At this point, both sides had a combined total of 60,000 nuclear bombs. Afghanistan could have led to World War III. In 1983, there are literally 5 separate incidences or ongoing situations that made people fear World War III the most ever since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets shot down a passenger jet traveling from the US to South Korea. They used a Soviet interceptor missile. This is a long story, but killing just 200 civilians could have led to the war. These are only a few of the incidences. Many of these events led to tens of thousands of deaths as it was, and they left permanent scars. But as bad as they were, they always threatened to lead to something far, far worse. That ends the story of partition and occupation of Germany for now. We will add more in a later video.